Okay, get to know the Bible. We're going to look at the book of Acts. We just did a couple sessions on the Gospels, and now we're going to jump into Acts, which is the fifth book of the New Testament. Today we're going to do a lot of people and places. One thing about the Bible, Old and New Testament, especially the New Testament, and especially when we get to Acts and some of the epistles, the letters, is the more you understand the culture, but also the people and places that the authors are writing to and about, the more you're going to glean from the text. Our our faith is founded in this Bible, what we call the Bible, and the Bible's full of historical, accurately places, a lot of archaeological, data that supports the narrative of the Bible. And so, the more you know about the people and the places, the names, and so forth, the easier you're going to track with the story. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Is we're going to look at people and places to kind of set up the story of Acts, how the church was birthed and how it spread, and just give you a better picture of that. And then next week we're going to jump, look at Paul and his journeys and how the church actually grew. As I introduced last week, the Bible, the Old and New Testaments all point to Jesus. The Old Testament's looking forward to Jesus, which we learn about in the Gospels, and the rest of the New Testament, from Acts through the Epistles, Revelation, are looking back at Jesus, because it's all about what he did on that cross and fulfillment of Old Testament law that gives us the atonement that we need to be free. And so it all points to Jesus. So as we look at the book of Acts, let's look at the broader picture first. Let's look at the Bible. These are the 66 books of the Bible. This is where they're written, right? As you can see, we have the majority of these are all Old Testament books here. The 39 Old Testament books. The majority of those Old Testament books were here in Israel. Old Testament was written in Israel. A few outside of Israel. Over here in Babylon, we have Daniel and Ezekiel. Over here in Persia, we have Esther. But the majority of the Old Testament books are written in the Israel area, in Judea and the northern kingdom of Samaria and so forth. However, when you get to the New Testament, not so much. You have some of the Gospels, and some of the letters, like James and Jude, are most likely written in Israel. But the majority of the New Testament books are actually written outside of Israel, primarily here in what they call Asia Minor, over in present-day Greece, and of course in Rome, up in Italy. And most of those are by Paul and Peter and John. And so that's what we're going to look at as we go through Acts. We're going to see how did these books get written, who they're written to. This is showing the message of how Christianity actually spread out of Israel to the Gentiles. And those of us that believe in Christ and the story of the Bible and are his witness, we are the Gentile church. The book of Acts doesn't end. It's still in. We're still in it. That's why this book is so foundational to our belief system, because we're still part of it. This is how it started, but it goes. It's still working today through the Holy Spirit until the end, until the second coming. So, yeah. So just the more you can understand about some of these places and so forth, the more you're gonna be able to follow the text and the narrative of the story. And it is a story. The Bible is a story, and the New Testament is a story. As Testament, the prophets are at the end of the Old Testament. Chronologically, they all take place over here, primarily in First Samuel through Second Kings, for the most part, and some in the return after the exile. Um, but so when you look at it chronologically and you kind of understand the story better, this is how it kind of fits. You have the earlier prophets in the northern kingdom, Amos and Hosea. Then you have these southern kingdom prophets that are preaching to Judah: Joel, Micah, Isaiah, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah. And then we have some of the foreign nation prophets that we talked about when we talked about the prophets: Jonah and Nahum prophesying about Nineveh, and Obadiah prophesying about Edom. Then we have the 70 years in exile. This is where Daniel and Ezekiel wrote their books when they were in Babylon. Then we have the three prophets at the end, after the exile, after the return. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are writing to the Ezra and Nehemiah time frame, when they're back in the promised land, building the temple in Jerusalem. And Esther also takes place at that point, towards the end. So as we see this in the Old Testament, the written order of the Bible isn't necessarily the chronological order. It's the same thing with the New Testament, especially as we start getting into Acts and the epistles, because what we're going to show in the next several weeks is how all these letters in the epistles line up in Acts, especially the Pauline letters, all the letters that Paul wrote. And it just really forms a comprehensive storyline that you're going to really enjoy and glean more information out of if you kind of understand the historical context and some people and places. So the Bible, in the New Testament, we have the four Gospels, which we covered. Now we're going to go into Acts, and then we have the letters, Paul's epistles, and then we have the general epistles, other letters written by James, Peter, John, and Jude. And then we have the end times, the prophetical book by John called Book of Revelation. So this is the written order of the Bible as you flip through the pages, but this is actually the chronological order of the New Testament, I should say. Is you have Paul's letters. Galatians was his first letter, then First and Second Thessalonians, then he has First, Second Corinthians, and Romans. These are the chronological order, and they're all written at particular times to particular people, and that's what we're going to really kind of showcase starting today, and it'll just give you a better way to follow the story, how it all lines up. And then John wrote his books at the end, many years later. So we'll come back to this in as we go through the sessions. So as we mentioned a few weeks ago, we went to the intertestamental period. The Grecian Empire, about 334 BC to 323 BC, when Alexander had that 10-year conquest, and he just conquered all this area in 10 years. It was amazing. They basically started with the process called Hellenization. Hellenization is the Greek culture and language being imported to all these places. So it was the first time that an empire actually imposed their culture and language on the empire, because before it would just be the Syrians may take over an area, but they would still speak their own language. So this started the process, and then under the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and others, over the next few hundred years, it got really gentrified into the area, really Hellenized, and everyone spoke Greek, became the prominent language. So much so that more Jews that lived outside of Jerusalem that lived in Jerusalem or Judea, they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. So we had this thing called the Septuagint written in 250 BC. The Old Testament Tanakh was translated to Greek, so that Jews that don't speak Hebrew anymore could actually read it. And it's about 250 BC. And so when you get to Jesus' time, this is the Bible that they mostly quote from, is the Septuagint, and also throughout the New Testament. What I'm going to show you is that there's three things that had to happen for the gospel to spread like it did, right? Number one, we had to have the language put into a text that everybody could read. So we had the Greek-speaking empire. It was put into Greek. So now we had a text that you can take somewhere, because you couldn't take a Hebrew Bible from Judea and travel all the way to Rome and try to teach people about this faith, or this person in Hebrew. They didn't speak Hebrew. They had no idea what it was, but they could do it in Greek. You go anywhere in the empire with Greek, and you have a coherent audience that could learn, an audience that could read it, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing was the Roman Empire. This is the Roman Empire at the time of Acts, time of Jesus, and the time of the book of Acts. And what the Romans did as they conquered, this area, is they brought in roads and infrastructure, aqueducts and bridges and all kinds of stuff. But the roads, they did over 250,000 miles in roads. And so now it was easy to get around. You can actually go places. You can actually walk from Ephesus and up to Troas, or over to Iconium, or whatever. There were all these roads, and this is how the gospel spread. Was Paul and others taking this Greek Bible on these Roman roads to major Roman cities? And the third thing that had to happen is they had to have someplace to go, right? They had the roads now to get there. They had the language to share it in, but where are they going to go? And that was what we called the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, the dispersion from about 587 BC to 300 AD. When the southern kingdom was conquered by the Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, in 587 BC, they were taken over to Babylon. And that's where the synagogue started. That's where they started having a worship center outside of Jerusalem. And then as the next few hundred years went by, next 500 years actually, 600 years, the Jews, through the Greece Empire, to the Roman Empire, they spread all over the area, all over the place. So now there's Jews everywhere. There's more Jews outside of Judea than inside Judea. And so they had all these places had synagogues. And so that's how Christianity spread. It was Paul and others taking a Greek Bible on Roman roads to Roman cities that had a Jewish population, that had synagogues, and they went and preached in the synagogue from the Tanakh, from the Old Testament, that Jesus was the Messiah. And that's the message that was preached, and and then the Spirit came, and that's how the church grew. So, and we're going to go more into that when we get into Paul's missionary journeys, what that actually looked like. But those are the three things that needed to have in place to have the gospel spread like it did. Without any one of those, it wouldn't have happened. Not the way it did anyway. Let's look at some people. it's just a small list. There's many others, but just wanted to give you some. And you don't have to memorize this. Although the more you get familiar with some of these names, because they're going to pop up all over the place, not just in Acts, but in the epistles, the letters, and other places. You're going to be able to recognize them and follow the storyline that's being told as all the books of the New Testament interconnect. And so we have Peter and John, the apostles. They're in the book of Acts. That's the first few chapters. You have James, the brother of Jesus. He became the leader of the Jerusalem church. He was a half-brother of Jesus. You have James, the apostle, who's John's brother. So you have John and John and James' brother. And he was actually killed in Acts 12. He was the first apostle to be killed. He wasn't the first martyr. That was Stephen. But he was killed quite early on by Herod. You have Barnabas. We meet Barnabas in Acts chapter 4. He says his name is Joseph, actually. He's a Levite from Cyprus, which is an island province in the Mediterranean, which we'll talk about later, because that's where he went on his first missionary journey, which makes sense, because that's where he's from. And then we see him again in Acts 11 through 15 with Paul. So Barnabas is a key player. Philip, in Acts chapter 6, we have 7 deacons appointed to help the apostles with the administration of the church. And 2 of those deacons, one was Philip, one was Stephen, are very prominent in the book of Acts. Philip became an evangelist. And so you see him in chapter 8 going to Samaria. And also you have the eunuch, Ethiopian eunuch that he converts. And he's just spreading the gospel throughout that area. And then we also see him in Acts 21 when Paul's coming back through on his way back to Caesarea and to Jerusalem. After his third trip, he stays with Philip the evangelist in Caesarea. Then we have a guy named Stephen. Stephen was the first martyr. He was a deacon in chapter 6. In chapter 7, he was arrested for spreading the gospel, and he gave a wonderful sermon to the Sanhedrin, the leading group of religious leaders, basically calling them out. And I'd encourage any Christian or anybody to read chapter 7 of Acts and just see the sermon and how he lays it out. And they got enraged and they stoned him to death. And that's when he got killed. And that's what caused the first persecution to spread among the church, and it made the church leave. That's when they went to Samaria and other places to escape Jerusalem, because they started to attack them. We meet a guy named John Mark in Acts chapter 12, and he is the author of the Gospel of Mark. He's also the either cousin or nephew of Barnabas. And so you see him in the book of Acts and other places. He actually had a falling out with Paul in Acts chapter 14, and then or chapter 15, and then he has a reconnection, as we see later in 2 Timothy and Colossians. But he also became very close to Peter. And so that's why we think the book of Mark, or the Gospel of Mark, is actually Peter's account. That's who Mark is. You meet John Mark. Gamaliel was Paul's teacher. We see him first in Acts 5. He's a Jewish leader. And they want to kill Peter and John because they healed this lame guy. And people are all going to them. And they're saying it's in the name of Jesus that we healed them. And Gamaliel is saying, look, if it's of man, this thing's going to fade away. But if this is of God, what are you going to do? Fight God? So he had some wisdom and kind of calmed them down. But we learn in chapter 22 of Acts that he was actually Paul's teacher. When Paul was young and a Pharisee, Gamaliel was his teacher. We meet Luke in Acts. He wrote Acts, actually, and he also wrote the Gospel of Luke. We read about him in Colossians and Timothy. Aquila and Priscilla. Aquila's a guy, and his wife Priscilla, we meet in Acts in Corinth. Paul meets them, and he starts to come close to them because they're tent makers like him. They work together, and they become converts, and they become leaders in the church. You actually go with him to Ephesus and help him start the church at Ephesus, and then he leaves them there to kind of lead the church at Ephesus. So they became very important. Then in Acts 18, we meet this guy named Apollos. He came from Alexandria, Egypt, to Ephesus. He was preaching Jesus, but he only knew of John's baptism, and he wasn't quite. He was talented, but he didn't quite have all the information. So Aquila and Priscilla took him aside and said, "Look, this is what we learned." And then he took it and he went to Corinth, and it said he spoke boldly for Jesus in the synagogues and other places in the Corinth church. And so the reason I mention these guys, you're going to see them not just in Acts, we're going to see them pop up. Like Apollos pops up again in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, pops up in Titus, letter to Titus. And then we have Timothy. We meet Timothy in Acts 16. Paul's going through Lystra. He picks up Timothy as a young man, and then he accompanies him for the next 2 missionary journeys. and becomes, as he ages, becomes a leader of the church. He was a bishop in Ephesus when Paul wrote First and Second Timothy. Many, many years later, Timothy was the leader of the Ephesian church. So we meet him as a young man and then watch him grow, well, with the church as it grows. And the same with Silas. We meet Silas in Acts 15, and he accompanies Paul. Sylvanus is another thing he's called by, and we see him in the gospel letters as well as accompanying Paul and helping with the ministry. We meet Lydia in Acts 16. She's the first European convert in Philippi. We have these two Roman procurators in Felix and Festus that we read about in Acts 23 to 26. We have this, and then we have Sanhedrin. This is the leading spiritual council of 70 Pharisees and Sadducees. So these are some people groups or people as well that, as you get familiar with them, you're going to see them pop up in the storyline as the story unfolds, and it kind of gives credence to the how it all fits together, because they're different authors writing at different times in these letters, but they're mentioning the same people in the same context, and it all kind of fits. That's what we're going to be exploring next couple weeks. Then we look over here, 1 Peter 1:1. This is Apostle Peter writing this letter many years later, after this event. And he says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles. So those who are elect exiles, so they're not in Jerusalem, they're dispersed, of the dispersion, diaspora, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Well, where is he talking about? Well, right here, Asia. This is where Ephesus is, and all the churches of Revelation. So I'm going to go back to that a few times as we go forward, because you're going to see maps that make that stick. But Asia was very prominent in an early church. And then, of course, we have Troas, where Paul had the dream to go to Macedonia and bring the church to Europe, and then Cyrene there in Libya. So there's just a few cities to be familiar with as you're going through the book of Acts and the New Testament. And then there's some provinces. The thing that can be a little tricky when you're reading the book of Acts and the New Testament, especially the epistles, is sometimes the author will say a city, or sometimes they'll say a province. So you might say, and then we went to Ephesus, or then we went to Asia. Well, it could be the same thing, because Asia is a province that Ephesus is in. And so if you know these provinces, a lot of times they'll refer to the provinces, like we went to Judea, went to Asia, or Pontus, or Achaia. And so it's good to be familiar with some of these, and I'm just going to read them too. We got Judea, Samaria, which are in Israel. Macedonia is up there in northern Greece. Syria, which is just north of Israel. Cyprus, the island province in the Mediterranean. Cilicia, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Pontus, Achaia, Italia, which is Italy. Crete, which is another island in the Mediterranean, and Bithynia, which is also in present-day Turkey, just above Asia. I don't expect you to memorize this right now, but come back, pause the slide or the video and look at it, or if you're getting the slides that I'm sending out, then just get familiar with some of these. Mainly, I'll share a few with you, just so you really need to know if you're going to want to follow the story in Acts as the church grows. This is the Roman Empire at the time of Acts. These provinces are color-coded. You can kind of see the difference, all right? So we're going to start over here in the east. So we have Syria, which is just north of Israel, which is below. This is Antioch, the capital of Syria, and also basically the home base for the Christian church back now. That's where Paul started off all three of his missionary journeys from. So the church really grew for centuries. They still have the Archbishop of Antioch, not the Archbishop, but the Patriarch of Antioch, one of the top patriarchs in the church for thousands of years. You have Tarsus, where Saul's from, so it's kind of in Saul or Paul's home area, right, in Cilicia. You have Galatia, which is this is where Paul and Barnabas went on their first missionary journey to Antioch, Pisidia, another Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, where they met Timothy on the second trip, and Derbe. This is where they went on their first missionary journey. That's why the book of Galatia was the first letter that Paul wrote. Makes sense, because that's the first place he went. We have Lycia, and then we have Asia, which is very, very important. So you want to know this: Asia is basically Western Turkey, present-day Turkey. Bithynia is up here to the north, and Pontus is over here on the Black Sea. And then you have Cappadocia over here in Eastern Turkey. So Cappadocia and Asia are two areas you really want to, it comes up a lot, and so does Pontus and Bithynia. And then we go to west a little bit, and we have Achaia, which is southern Greece, present-day Greece. You have Corinth and Athens underneath my face there, and then you have Macedonia to the north. That's where you have Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, all the places we're going to read about next week when we go through Paul's second missionary journey. And then over here we have Rome. Of course, we have Italy, and we have Rome, and so forth. So that's kind of just a couple provinces to be familiar with as you go to the map. You're going to see them again shortly, and just as through repetition, hopefully you're familiar with these places. I guarantee you'll never read the New Testament again the same. Once you have some basic geography and people groups down, the story is going to come to life in a way it hasn't before. So as we look at the book of Acts, let's look at how it's formatted or laid out. So we have the author is Luke the doctor, who's a physician, a Gentile. So he's the only Jewish non-author of the whole Bible, except for Job possibly, but definitely in the New Testament. And he did a wonderful job, very meticulous. He interviewed everybody, wrote down a lot of nuances, a lot of detailed notes in his gospel and in the book of Acts. And these are the sections. You basically have two main sections, chapter 1 through 12, and then chapters 13 through 28. 1 through 12 is mainly Peter and Philip, and then after chapter 12, basically it's all about Paul and his journeys and his companions and where he went. And so Jesus has a quote in the first, right before he ascends, in the first chapter of Acts, where he tells his disciples to be my witness. When the Spirit comes upon you, be my witness in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And that's exactly how it played out. First Peter went to the Jews in Jerusalem and others apostles. Then after Stephen was killed, through the persecution, they spread out to Samaria. And then after that, Judea, and then Judea and Samaria. And then from there, they were spread out to the ends of the earth under Paul, into the Roman Empire. This really took off. And so that was the plan, and that's exactly what happened. So as you look at this layout, you have the first 4 chapters, the Spirit, and then how the church grew, and the growth of the church and the persecution in 5 through 7. Then we have more persecution. We have kind of the growth of the church and the first persecution in 7, then more persecution. But this is where the church really started growing. Philip, the evangelist, up in Samaria, and Peter and John and everyone preaching. Then we have Paul's conversion in chapter 9. He was a Pharisee that hated the church, which we'll look at more next week. That became the biggest evangelist the world ever know. And then we have expansion of the church up to Antioch, and then we have all the missionary journeys of Paul. So that's kind of how the book of Acts is laid out. If you want to pause the video and just look at this a little more, you can get familiar with it. This next slide is, I'm not going to go through it. It's a little too much information. Once again, if you want to pause the screen, you can look at kind of this is more of a detailed breakdown of the book of Acts, a little more specific, and there's some good information in here, but I'm going to go through it now. Peter had some early sermons. So when the Spirit came in Acts chapter 2 and Pentecost, Peter had a sermon at Acts right when the Pentecost came, and 3,000 people were saved, the Bible says. And then right after that, him and John healed a beggar, a lame beggar. And then he has another sermon in chapter 3, right after he heals this guy. And I'm going to read this to you. Just read along with me. I want to show you what is Peter actually saying as he's preaching Jesus for the first time. This is the second sermon. What is he actually saying about who Jesus is? Let's pick up here. And while he clung to Peter, he being the lame man that was healed, and John and all the people, utterly astounded, ran together to them in the portico called Solomon, which is by the temple. And when Peter saw it, he addressed to them. So these people came to see this thing that happened with this lame man being healed. And then Peter addresses this crowd. Men of Israel, why do you wonder at this? Or why do you stare at us as though by our own power or piety we have made him walk? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of our fathers glorified his servant Jesus before you delivered over and denied in the presence of Pilate, when he had decided to release him. But you denied the holy and righteous one and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, and you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. And his name, by faith in his name, has made this man strong, whom you now see and know. And the faith that it is through Jesus has given this man this perfect health in the presence of you all. So he's given Jesus the glory, but he's saying Jesus was God's prophet. And he's going back to the Old Testament, back up here in chapter 13, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of our forefathers. He's called them out. This is who we believe in. And he glorified his servant Jesus, by whom you handed over to Pilate, whom you denied, and whom you killed, the author of life. So he's kind of calling them out, but he's letting them know, but it's okay. Jesus, he's alive now, and he's raising people. And he goes on, now, brothers, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did your rulers. But what God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets. See, now he's going back to the Old Testament. He's preaching right out of the Old Testament, right out of the Tanakh. What God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, that Christ would suffer and raise and be fulfilled, has been fulfilled. That Christ will suffer has been fulfilled. Repent, therefore, and turn back, that your sins may be blotted out, of times of refreshing may come to the presence of the Lord, so that he may, and then Christ appointed to Jesus. So he's preaching Jesus from the Old Testament, from the prophets. The prophets told us about Jesus. And he goes on, whom the heaven must receive until the time of restoring all things, about which God spoke again by the mouth of the holy prophets long ago in the Old Testament. Moses said, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. You shall listen to him, and whatever he tells you, and it shall be that every soul who does not listen to that prophet shall be destroyed from the people. And all the prophets who have spoken from Samuel and those who come after him also proclaim these days. You are the sons of the prophets, and the covenant that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. God, having raised up his servant, sent him to you first to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness. So he's calling them out again. He's pointing back to the Old Testament, pointing back to what Moses said, what the prophets said, what Samuel said, that's who this Jesus is. And that's going to be the theme throughout all the rest of Acts with Paul and others as they go places. They preach Jesus from the Old Testament. That was the message they took with the Greek Septuagint on the Roman roads to the Jewish synagogues. They preached Jesus from the Old Testament. That is a message that birthed the church. And that is the message we got to cling to today. Because it's a supernatural message. We have the text from the Old Testament. That was written 100 years before Jesus. We can point to it. It's not just Jesus rose from the dead. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-6. It's Jesus rose from the dead according to the scriptures, was buried and rose again according to the scriptures. It was a written account. It's very powerful once you understand that. So now we're just going to run through the first 8 chapters of Acts with a quick visual, just kind of summarize some of the things that happen. And then next week, we're going to pick up with Paul's conversion, and then how the church spread out of Israel and Samaria and Judea and spread to the Roman Empire through these missionary journeys that Paul and others went on. But this is Israel. We have Judea here, and then up Samaria, just north of that. And then Galilee, of course, up at the top. And so as it started, we're going to look at basically Peter's routes, Peter and John, what they did together, and then, Philip's routes. Philip the evangelist, one of the deacons that became very prominent in evangelizing. So down here in Judea, Peter, he's over here in Lydia, and he heals a guy, Ananias, and then he hears that one of the believers, Dorcas, is over here, and she's sick, and she's dying, and she died. And so he goes over to Joppa, and then he heals her, raises her from the dead, basically. And then he gets this dream. To go up to Caesarea Philippi. And then at the same time, we have this guy named Cornelius having a dream to send 2 of his servants. He's a Roman centurion and soldier, and he sends 2 of his servants down to look for a guy named Peter in Joppa. And so Peter comes up, and then Cornelius and the whole house gets saved. And that's the first Gentile. That's when the first Gentile convert, the first non-Jew, becomes a Christian. And then Peter goes back and reports to the Jewish leaders, James and others in Jerusalem, saying what happened, and they're rejoicing, and they're like kind of surprised, but they're accepting it, that this message isn't just for Jews, it's for Gentiles too. And that kind of plants the seed that this is a bigger message than just for the Jews. It's going to be a worldwide message. And so that all happened in Acts chapter 10. Okay. And so that's kind of just a quick run through to some of the highlights of the first 8 chapters, almost 10 chapters of Acts. We're going to go back to chapter 9 and look at Paul's conversion, because 8, 9, 10, 11, the Bible kind of skips around a little bit. It goes back and forth between things, as we're going to see. So we're going to go back and look at next week at Acts chapter 9, Paul's conversions, and then the story of Paul and his impact on early Christianity. And then we're looking at his missionary journeys, at the message he actually took outside of Judea, outside of Samaria, to the Roman Empire, all throughout the Roman Empire. What was he saying? Why was it so effective? Why were people being saved? Why was the Spirit moving? It's very powerful. And once you understand that, you kind of get a better idea of what our mission should be, what the Spirit wants us to be preaching and living and so forth. So it's very, very appropriate for us, very practical for us to really have a good grasp of the book of Acts, specifically Paul's missionary journeys. So with that, we'll see you next time.